So in this video, just a little bit of a quick start. So how do we get into QCoDeS now? How do we import our first instrument? So first of all, we start at this point where we installed QCoDeS already and where QCoDeS is also importable here in our Jupyter notebooks. So the question is now, how can we import the instruments that we, for example, use in our laboratory? In this case, I want to use a QCoDeS source meter in order to perform an IV sweep as a first measurement. And the question is now, how do I get this instrument? And basically there are two different sources. First of all, we have the QCoDeS documentation, linked to that as always below the video. And here you have all the different instruments that where drivers are already written in QCoDeS. So what you can do is, for example, you can say I need a HP 8133A module, then you can just search for that in here and you will find it. And the same is of course also true for the QCoDeS. So we just search for the QCoDeS. And here we have all the different QCoDeS. And you see it's on the QCoDeS instrument drivers Tektronix and then QCoDeS. So this is the one that I want now. And the question is, how do I import that? And in order to do so, there's a very simple way to find out how to do all of that. And this is by just looking at the examples for using QCoDeS. And then you always have examples for the drivers also later on. Let's see, where is it? So there's an example for different kind of drivers and how to interact with them by just going to examples of using QCoDeS, and then in drivers you find various different drivers and how to actually use them. And then you can now basically search for your instrument and then see how it's being used. Like, let's just say we wanted to look at the QCoDeS 2600. Then if I have a look at that, here is an example of how to import it. But as you can see, now in this scenario here, there is no example for the particular QCoDeS that I wanted to use. So there's different ways of finding out how to do that now. First of all, I can go back to the driver packages and then I can go to the QCoDeS that I wanted to have, which was the QCoDeS 2400 module. Then I go here and then I see here the name of our class. And now if I look at that a little bit more close, I see it's QCoDeS instruments drivers Tektronix QCoDeS 2400, QCoDeS 2400. Now I go back to that example of the 2600 and then I see from QCoDES.instrument drivers Tektronix QCoDeS 2600 channels import QCoDeS 2600. So in my case, and I'm just copying this now to my notebook, I don't want the 2600, but I rather want the 2400. So I do tab for the autocomplete. And then I can just press enter here and say import. And now if I compare with the other one again, it says QCoDeS 2600. And here it also says after the first 2400, it says again 2400. So this is the class that I want to import. So I just say QCoDeS 2400 again. And if I now press enter, I basically have this one imported. So how do I get it into QCoDeS now? So how can I work with that instrument? Well, this is being explained here. So here we basically create a new object of that class. So it's a QCoDeS 2600. Then we give it a name. In this case, it's called QCoDeS. Maybe I would call it source meter. And then we have to tell the address. And the address of the instrument is something that you can either commonly see if you switch on the instrument. Sometimes they tell you their name, so which is the address where they are basically saved, or which is the address where you can talk to them. Or you could use tools like, for example, the NIMAX Automation Explorer, and then just browse through the different devices that are connected and then just look the different addresses of the instruments. So in analogy to that, I could now also make an instrument which I call QCoDeS, or maybe SRC for source meter. Then I call that source meter and then I say, of course, 2400, because this class here is referring to the class up here, and then I have to tell it the address. In this particular case, since I'm doing this on my private PC and I'm not connected to any kind of device, I will not be able to show you how that looks like. So if I press enter here, I just get an error because there's nothing connected and there's no Visa implementation on my computer. But of course, in your case, you may have to install Visa according to the QCoDeS documentation. I will also put a link down below. And then if that is basically working, you have to write down the actual address of your instrument. That's it. Whoa, but wait. Sometimes you have the case that you actually want to import an instrument which is not in QCoDeS. So you go through all the drivers here, you look at all the different driver packages, and then you don't find the instrument that you want to import. Well, there are different cases. If you have a unique instrument which basically no one else owns in the world, then you probably have to write the driver yourself, and there's also going to be a tutorial on how to do that. But if you use an instrument that someone else is using, it could also just be the case that no one contributed that one to QCoDeS so far, because they might only have written a sloppy driver or something like that. But the world of open source sometimes helps us to get things a little bit faster than doing it by ourselves. So how could that actually look like? Well, I go to GitHub. This is github.com. And then I go to the QCoDeS project, which is /QCoDES, and this is the QCoDES project. And as you can see, there are 72 contributors, and then there's also a lot of different forks, so 153 in the moment where I record this video. And there's probably going to be one fork where someone wrote a driver which could be useful for you. So how can you find out about that? So in the QCoDeS project, like here, the drivers are always stored in a certain particular drive. So you navigate to QCoDeS, then you go to instrument drivers, and in here you find basically the same structure of folders that we saw before in the documentation. So this, the way that the documentation is being ordered here, being saved there, is the same one that is being used here inside the folders. And if you now go to the forks, you see that there's 153 different forks, so 153 people that basically own a copy of that QCoDeS branch and that may have started to develop their own drivers. And now you can of course say, let's say for example, I would know that the QTech in Aachen is owning that particular driver that I'm searching for. Then it may make sense that I go to that particular QCoDeS document here, to that QCoDeS project, and then in the branches I can see, oh, indeed there are some drivers that they already provided, that they worked on, that may be helpful for me. So I could use them and then later on write them a little email, thank you that you provided the driver for me. It's really useful and helps me to do my experiments. I'm looking forward to further collaborations in the future or something like that. So there are some ways to also find drivers if you don't find them immediately in the main master branch or in the documentation of the QCoDeS project itself. And with that, this is really the end of the video.